Welcome back to the Revitalist podcast, where we are changing the narrative of mental health. So today, I have a guest who actually introduced me to psychedelics. And it's interesting because, honestly, I knew nothing about psychedelics. I knew about ketamine, right? But in this world today, we're not really putting ketamine into the psychedelic space. She's slowly getting over there. But I met a man who knew a lot about psychedelics. And then the most interesting piece, too, is he's not a provider by trade. He is someone who's really in the mission to really help increase access, help provide care, love, acceptance, all this stuff. So I've learned so much from my guest today, Nick Murray. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
My background, I'm a geek. I really got into this from the technology side of things. I saw the opportunity to quantify, make sense of, put some numbers to what we know works in the psychedelic world. And the West needs to see numbers, needs to see data. And so when I saw the opportunity to blend my first love, I guess you could call it, which is technology, with my other love, which is natural medicine, it was just a perfect marriage to make Wake. And so Wake is focused on natural psychedelics that are quantified. We work with labs in the DEA labs in the US to actually test our product, and use FDA devices like blood pressure cuffs, EEGs, ECGs to really monitor what's going on before, during sometimes, and then after an experience.
So having your tech life and being in psychedelics, I feel like you probably saw a need to kind of utilize your skill set in the psychedelic space.
Absolutely.
But that's not really what drove you to love psychedelics. So why do you feel aligned with the mission of psychedelics?
I've seen them work personally, with people really close to me, and then just people that I don't know, and I've looked into the research myself. This is something that's been around longer than all of us. Mushrooms were growing here before any humans were walking the planet. So there's a lot of reverence, there's a lot of respect for them. And when I see something so small and quite safe, be able to help people that have been going through decades of SSRIs or anti-anxiety meds or both, I have to listen. We have to listen. And when it's not something that can be patented, when it's not something that's extremely rare, it makes me wonder, why hasn't this been opened up to the world? And that's when my curiosity takes over. And that's when I get quite excited to say, I want to be a part of this. I want to actually, be a piece of this and help shepherd it along a little bit.
So when we first met a couple of years ago now, maybe more than that, I came from the Western world with ketamine. And you're kind of from the Eastern world, kind of fuck the Western world kind of thing, to where you believed in all the natural stuff. But now that we've kind of worked in the space long enough, it's like I've learned a lot of things from you. And I think you've probably learned some things from me, which it's like the Eastern and the Western world are kind of like integrating. And that's something that I'm seeing in the psychedelic space, that people are trying to make that happen. But like, I feel like we're in, kind of like this awesome transition, like world transition, to where you've got good guys from the Eastern side, good guys from the Western side, trying to come together to make a new civilization, to where not only are we helping the brain to heal, but we're also having, like you said, the quantifying metrics to where it all makes sense. So, your views on, because I know a lot of people like push natural. And then there's also ketamine, which is synthetic, but it's a synthetic that creates a natural response. What would you tell people that are looking into psychedelics and that are looking for something different? Like, how do they know, like, can they trust the mushrooms? Can they trust ketamine? Can they trust LSD? Can they trust MDMA? Like, what, to a newcomer coming to the space, what's some of this, like, the basic things that they should look for if they're completely like me? When I came talking to you, I was completely ignorant to all this stuff, right?
Sure.
And I had enough courage to like come down to Jamaica and actually watch things and see people's life change. And then I was able to put it kind of into my world with ketamine and see that these two modalities they're different, but they're very complementary to each other. But yeah, say I'm 40-year-old female who has a kid and I'm stuck or I'm struggling, and like, what's the next step? Like, maybe I'm interested in psychedelics, but I don't know, right? I mean, it's not legal in the States. Yeah, it's decriminalized. But, you know, there's all kinds of retreats out there. How do I know if I can trust them? How do I, like, what guidance would you give somebody like that?
Like anything, I think, do your research, whether that's reading, YouTube, talk to people, make some phone calls to some of these retreat centers. You need to do some of your own due diligence. We test our product. We make sure that it doesn't have microbiology, mycotoxins, heavy metals. That's the table stakes. Let's make sure there's nothing dirty or messy inside. And then we quantify it. What's the percentage of psilocybin, psilocin in our mushrooms? Now, that's thanks to a partnership we have with the DEA lab in Florida that we've worked with for a number of years. And so they are the ones that we lean on when we're trying a new strain or we're trying a new product. We say, can you test this out? Can you tell us, is it higher, lower? Is there anything in there that shouldn't be? We do partner with partners. So we do have a chocolate partner. We need to make sure that their chain of custody is clean and they're not putting anything into our product. But that doesn't mean that everybody does that level of clarity. And mushrooms can look similar to others. And if you don't know what you're looking at, and especially if you're foraging, then you could get yourself into some trouble because there are some poisonous mushrooms out there. So it's a little bit of a mix of doing your own homework, because this is your body, your mind. You don't just out and out trust anyone. And then see if you can talk to some of their previous guests, talk to some of the providers who will actually be at the retreat. There's a number of similar questions that we get. And so when people ask them to us, a lot of the time they think it's the first time we've heard it. But there's many common worries, things that cause people like anxiety. So, you know, don't just be on your own. Get in touch.
So to me, people in the psychedelic space will say, it's natural, it's safe, right? And they just generally accept that concept. It's natural, it's safe. What risks are associated with psychedelic retreats? Like, what risks are, so you just talked about the mushrooms, right? Yeah, you need to understand the product, but most people aren't mycologists that actually look at the product. They don't know what to look at, right? They're just expecting that when you give it to me, it's going to be safe, it's going to be clean, right? And they're not testing it. Those people aren't. They don't know, right?
Yep.
So, you know, so that's one thing, right? It's like what you said. It's like they should ask about the product. Where did it come from? How did you get it? You know, because people, when it's natural, it's safe. So if they're out foraging in the woods, and who knows if they're whatever contaminant, right? Like if a dog pooped next to the mushroom and the mushroom grew and you're ingesting E. coli, like you can get incredibly sick from that stuff.
Sure.
So that's one risk. The other risks, I would say, in the psychedelic space, me personally, I would say the providers that are in the space, right? Because there's a whole variety of people who exist, and they should exist because it's all different levels. But, you know, there's coaches, there's therapists, there's providers in this space. And one thing that I see, me personally, and you can talk about this too if you want, but coaches specifically, if it's a coach who did training for 48 hours, probably not the best person to start your journey with, because they may see the benefits of, yes, but if shit hits the fan kind of thing, how are they going to help you during that time of critical need, right? So, you know, coaches will sometimes come into the space and they may not have all the training that they need. Therapists may come into the space thinking they do have all the training and they know exactly what you need, and they'll actually try to overcompensate and like lead you down a path that you may not necessarily need to go. And then providers, you know, sometimes will just give you the psychedelic, and then we'll sit here and watch you for about 6 hours. Let us know if you need anything, but they don't intervene, because there's a lot of providers, and I disagree with this, who let people be in the space for like 6 hours. And if someone's like reliving or like trying to work through things, but they don't know how to be grounded. A lot of providers won't offer grounding because they think that people need to figure that out for themselves during the experience, which I completely disagree with. So coming from a community mindset, like what would you, like me talking about that, I think those are risks, right? With coaches and therapists, providers. What do people need to consider when they're coming into the space, when they're looking at like who's doing the retreat? Like from a community perspective, from your perspective, if you looked at a retreat, what would you say would be some risks as well as some benefits to look for?
Well, I think you want somebody who's experienced in this modality. So if they come from the coaching side, if they come from the psychiatrist side, to me, it means less than how much experience do they have with the particular drug that's being induced and ingested, personally and within a group. So them as a provider and them as actually as a user. That's the most important, I think, because there's so many walks of life. There's so many people on different drugs, polypharma. They might lie on their intakes. You need somebody who's dealt with a whole mix of different people with different issues, that has the experience. You want that Swiss Army knife kind of person that's been in it, that's seen it, that's dealt with themselves, their own issues. And that's a difficult thing because there's a lot of people that operate underground and they don't want to brag about 300, 500, 700 different experiences that they've been a part of because they could get themselves into some trouble. Right. That's my most important kind of, warning, I guess, or advice for people is go with a provider who's actually experienced either psilocybin or iboga or MDMA or ketamine. Now, not to say that there shouldn't be people learning, but the learners should be paired always with somebody very experienced. So we always get inbound on LinkedIn and by email with providers or providers to be that want to be involved. And we would only allow them to be involved if somebody like yourself or Jillian, both of you were here, so they could learn from your experience. And then after a number of actual retreats that they were a part of, that they actually did themselves, would I feel confident for them to actually run a retreat. And even then they would be with somebody who's experienced.
Yeah, I hear that. It's like, it's them being specialists in that, with that specific drug based on their individual experience.
But and a combination of individual themselves ingesting it and then also them actually administering it,
right,
and being a facilitator.
So it's two different things, right? So you're talking about experiential, and that's something experiential trainings, which is very common in therapy, don't exist in the medical space, right? So in the medical world, we don't do experiential. Like, I'm not like, well, let me try some fentanyl before I do an anesthetic on somebody. They used to do that. Cocaine was the big one, where they would do cocaine. They would test it before they'd use it on other people. And there's a lot of people that died from drug addiction. It was a guy, it was one of the guys, the godfathers basically of surgery, for Johns Hopkins. He was one of them. He was a chronic drug addict, opiates and cocaine. But that was when we used it to make sure it was safe. Mm-hmm. So me personally, coming from the medical field, I was completely against people doing psilocybin or ketamine or whatever else, because rate of addiction of anesthesia providers is 30%. Mm-hmm. And if I see any drugs that I have, free access to, I always think, well, is this going to increase my risk of addiction? Mm-hmm. But one thing I did notice, like with ketamine specifically, and with psilocybin, but ketamine was where it changed me, because I was in the clinic and I was looking at therapists, and me personally, like, I'm pretty open and welcoming, and I try to stay cool, calm, right? Even if like whatever's going on, the world's falling up, I still try to stay pretty cool and calm. But I did notice I was going into a room a couple of years ago, and I had a therapist who, like, her body language was so uncomfortable to me. When I walked in, I just picked up on it, right? So when people's levels of consciousness are changing with psilocybin or whatever, psychedelic or ketamine, and people don't understand what that change of consciousness looks like, they get very uncomfortable. So I went in and she was like sitting there, it was like she was at a spelling bee or something, and like extreme posture, like closed off and just staring there like a cat, scared, or deer or whatever, just staring at the client. I was like, I could feel it. Like she was scared to death. And I was like, and I put my hand on her leg. I'm like, you good? And she's like, yes. She's
scared of the drug, or that she hadn't.
She was scared of the change, right? So when people with ketamine specifically, when they have changes in their levels of consciousness, and this is, from my anesthesia viewpoint, like I understand the changes in levels of consciousness really, really well. But the difference with the change of consciousness with psychedelics is you're not going to like, I'm going to turn your brain off and then you're going to get paralyzed like we do in anesthesia to like make you not move. The change in consciousness in psychedelics is your external shell kind of comes down, but then your internal shell kind of comes up, right? So people's, when they're sitting there on ketamine specifically, it could be like, say me and you are talking right now, and I'm moving my hands and I've got my legs crossed and, I'm engaging. When ketamine kicks in, I start becoming more internal with my thought processes. So instead of looking you in the eyes, it will start messing with me. Like, am I paying attention enough to him? Am I, so you start like having this self-reflection where we encourage people to kind of like, it's like, just sit back, you're fine. And just, if you need to look at something, stare at a wall. There is something just, grossly, right? So, and the people's movements, typically with ketamine, their physical movements become less.
Okay.
So they're kind of like moving into this like, meditative space to where it's much more peaceful from their external shell. But internally is when it's starting to heat up some, right? So they're starting to have a lot of these memories and thoughts and colors and things. But when they're doing that, like their respirations can change. So they can have, quicker breaths and deeper breaths. You can say, hey, Nick, and you may not respond to me. But you're not responding to me, not because you can't hear me. You can hear me just fine. You're not responding to me because you're in a really good thought pattern and you're making a lot of connection at that time.
Right.
So therapists, it's like, I tried to asked for Nick and he didn't respond, but he did like a minute later, and so if they don't understand kind of that communication pattern, it changes, right? And same for psilocybin. I always tell people, like, you process before you speak with psychedelics. You don't speak and then you process.
Sure.
So that was something. When I saw the therapist that way, I actually went down to my law firm and got them to make a gross picture of, is it legal for us to do experiential on each other in the States? And they came up with a, conclusion of yes, it is. And if anything, they want them to be doing it with us. So it's at least under medical provider and thing like that. But allowing people to feel that empathy and kind of be on that same level of consciousness or whatever you want to call it. It's a different level that people don't understand in life unless they've done psychedelics. And then once they've been on that level of consciousness, then they're able to empathize more.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah. So risks, right? Kind of going over those because people are scared. They want to try psychedelics and they're scared to death. So, and people don't talk to them about risks. They're like, oh, it's fine. It's natural. It's safe. Just because something's natural and safe doesn't mean that there's risk. So we've talked about your product being contaminated, talked about providers or like people leading their retreats. What would you want those to look like? So talked about that, them having experience with your specific substance. And then what else? What else would you say are risks in the space?
I'd say the risks are really related to where the person's at in their life. There are some family risks. If there's a history of schizophrenia or bipolar, or a number of other neurological disorders, then, that needs to be taken into account by the providers that are going to be helping you along your journey. But more so, it's where you're at in your head. Are you at a break in your life where psychedelics might help long-term, but maybe today is not the best time to ingest a psychedelic because you're frantic, you're manic, you're not, in your best mind state. And that is tough because you have businesses out there that want the clients, that want, you know, they want to help and they want to keep their businesses running. And so, you know, maybe they'll look the other way, or maybe they'll let somebody come through that maybe needs a few weeks to compose himself and deal with a sudden death or a sudden breakup or a sudden job loss, whatever it might be. So that gets into set and setting, which is very important. And it's almost a cliche in our industry now, but mindset and the setting you're in, which includes the people and the weather and, you know, the safety elements or the perceived safety, all of that is really important. And if it's a place overseas like we are, we try to show where you'll be working, who you'll be working with, some of our previous clients' experience. We can really try to give you a good idea before you even get on the plane and come visit us, that this is a safe place, that we've done hundreds of these, that we truly want the best for you. So I think being honest with yourself, where your mind is at, where you physically are at in your life, is a good one. And only you as the patient can understand truly where you're at, and be honest with yourself. We have a lot of people who suffer from alcohol addiction that come down and they can't even, you know, get on the plane without a drink. So now they arrive hungover or maybe even somewhat intoxicated. So there's those kind of issues where people need it, but they also need to be in the right mindset for the psychedelics to work.
So maybe a good recommendation for people that are looking to come down would be to find a therapist or a coach who has training on set and setting, which would be like prep, right? So prep sessions, to where they kind of talk to them what it would look like, different things like that. Would you say that would be a good first step?
Yeah, I think them finding somebody they trust, that they like, that they can talk to, that has experience in the field, that's done preferably a number of previous retreats, previous clinical doses, and that way that they can start to get comfortable with where they're going, who's going to be there, what their experience level is, and then it usually helps their family members to be more comfortable with their decision as well. But at the same time, it's their decision to make. So yeah, I think that would be a good first step.
Yeah. So talking about therapy, and this is something too, it's different, right? In the medical space, there's talk therapy. So everybody knows about talk therapy, or they know about like CBT or, you know, IFS, like all these different types of talk therapy, versus therapy in the psychedelic space is more, while they are utilizing these different types of like CBT and IFS with the therapy in the psychedelic space is more so prep during, you know, intra is what I call it, or like integration, which is afterwards, or transition. And that's something that you don't see in the traditional medical field, is you don't see prep sessions, integration sessions, transition sessions. They don't necessarily exist.
Sure.
So with people looking at retreats, like I know there's a lot of retreats out there, and there are, and it's confusing. It's very confusing for people. So say if somebody wants to go on a retreat and say it's like 3 days and you come down, this is what we do, and then you're good. People who are still, you know, looking at questioning the space, they want to try it, but not, how would you recommend them to look at like the prep sessions and transition and integration and try to learn about that sector from a safety standpoint?
You know, it's everybody, different strokes for different folks. Some people have listened to enough podcasts and they're put on by people that they trust, that they're already good to go, so to speak. And they would love to learn more, but at the same time, they don't need to learn more to get comfortable, to have a good experience. So that's almost the least, or the simplest clientele, you could call it. And then you do have people that are, they might have some anxiety, and they really need to know exactly who and where and what. And for them, certainly, I think so. I think the more you can learn about it, the better. But there's an old cartoon that makes me think of it right now, where there's a guy and he's looking at two doors, and one is heaven and one is books about heaven, and he's not sure which one to do. And so you can get a kind of analysis paralysis. If you really go into the weeds, you can start going a little too deep without actually doing the thing. And so be careful with that, because it's one of those things that's so difficult to describe to somebody without them actually doing it. And so you can read the books, you can watch the YouTubes, you can listen to the podcasts, it'll help. It'll definitely give you some insight, but doing it is going to be the best teacher. So don't jump into it haphazardly or crazy, but at the same time, do some research to get comfortable, and then make a decision, and then go with it. Because I feel psychedelics is a teacher on its own, and so as long as you're doing it safely and not in a braggadocious way, I think you're going to have a good experience, and you're going to learn, and it's going to empower your own healing. It's going to give you strength to make more decisions upon your own well-being.
So let's talk about psychedelic experiences during. And that's something I've talked about before, to where people are like, don't tell them anything, right? Because everybody wants to share their story to somebody else. Sure. And you don't want to duplicate that. But then a lot of people will say, here, just take it. You'll be fine. Right. And I've seen people come to the clinics in the States who've done psychedelics, and literally they come in shaking because they're so traumatized about what happened, because nobody talked to them about set and setting. Mm-hmm. Nobody gave them any guidance prior to as to how to navigate the experience. Sure. So what would you tell people, like, what is the experience like with you sharing share your viewpoint as to what you tell somebody that was like, okay, what's it like? Am I going to lose my mind? What would you tell them?
Well, I can really only speak to psilocybin, because that's the one I know the most. You'll remember everything. And that's usually where I start, because people have these preconceived notions of being hypnotized, and hypnotizing usually means you don't remember it. It means, with psychedelics, there's a lot of the fear and the uncertainty and the doubt that floats around this space, that they'll do something silly, that they won't remember it, that they might hurt themselves. So they will remember everything, which is very helpful.
But I have trauma. I don't want to remember anything. I don't want anything to come up. Mm-hmm. Are you trying to tell me that when I do a psychedelic experience, trauma is going to come up and I'm going to feel all that? Because there's no way I'm doing it if I'm going to do that. No. I've heard that so many times.
Yeah, and that's the next one, is that you can go to a place from your past and actually go, maybe not relive it, but go through everybody's perspective. So let's say there was two people involved. You can see it obviously from your perspective without the emotion. You can see it from their perspective without your emotion, where traditional talk therapy will get you to relive the experience. Your brain doesn't know the difference between a memory and reliving it. So all that fear, all that anger, all the emotions come up again. And then in our traditional talk therapy world, okay, the hour's done, come back in 2 weeks, and we're going to relive it again. And your forebrain and your body just constantly goes into this fight and flight. And it's no wonder you don't get better. Yeah. And so psychedelics gives you the opportunity to see it from a third party, bird's eye view, to not have the emotion, but to have the empathy of what they thought, what you thought, how you could learn from this, where you never have that experience normally under non-psychedelic terms. Usually there's always an emotional attachment, and that stops your ability to get past things and to actually deal with them. So the fact that you're going to relive something and not have the fear or the anxiety or the anger, and then you're going to remember all of it, that's the most powerful two kind of sides to psychedelics.
Yeah. So it takes you, so the way that I look at it is like, say there was a significant event that happened when you were 9 years old, mm-hmm. right? And then say when you get triggered, you go right back to that event. and you feel it, you know, and in quantum physics, they talk about how our brain doesn't understand time. Time's in planes. So you could be 50 years old, but then your brain's going to go back to that trauma that was lived at 9, and you're going to relive the emotions at 50 years old because your brain doesn't understand that was 41 years ago.
Sure.
So with psychedelics, it gives you, it will bring up the situation when you were 9, but it will give you an aerial view, like a drone over it. And then that drone, when you're looking at it, you're then looking at it through a 50-year-old's perspective on the entire scene, not the 9-year-old's interpretation of the scene.
Yeah.
And in that way, you're able to kind of have, you know, an all-inclusive viewpoint, I think, and see things that were really, really big to you at 9 years old. You're like, oh, wow, that had so much impact on me then.
Yep.
But really, I mean, it's really nothing now because I was 9, right? It was like, you know, I got hit in the face with a baseball when I was 9 and it broke my nose and I thought my whole life was over, right? So it was like, you see that at 50 now and you're like, oh, okay. It's a kid who got a broken nose.
Sure.
But the brain got stuck to the emotional connection when they were 9 years old.
Yep.
So it keeps growing. And then as a 50-year-old, you keep living that day-to-day emotion. And it literally feels like you're reliving that trauma from a 9-year-old.
Yeah. 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 I think our Western culture doesn't necessarily deal with things and doesn't necessarily, we hide from it. We hide from anger. We hide from pain. We hide from.
Well, we hide from them because we've been told they're bad.
Yeah.
Because you're ill. Because you can't control yourself.
Right. But that doesn't help anything. It doesn't
Right.
help anybody, society included. So this Eastern way of just confronting things, dealing with them, going through them, is not foreign, but somewhat foreign to our Western medical system, where we cover things up, a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound type of thing.
Yep.
And it doesn't fix anything, but there's a whole machine that revolves around it, and it benefits that machine. And so we haven't had an alternative until now, as far as our Westerners. There's been many in the world who have always done this, and this has always been the main way. We lost our way a little bit, and now we've made our way back a bit.
Trying. Yeah, you're right. Because I talk to people about emotions, right? Because a lot of times when emotions come up, we think that the emotion's coming up and it's wrong and we're ill because we're crying all the time or we're angry all the time. So what people start doing is they stop trusting themselves for when this emotion comes up. I don't want that emotion. I don't agree with that. I don't know why that's happening. So then they start lacking trust in themselves, when in reality, they need to trust the emotion, even though they may disagree with it.
Sure.
So then that way you're able to kind of have an analytical view of that emotion, but then you're kind of a third party on like, okay, I hear that I'm frustrated right now, or I can see that I'm sad right now. There's zero reason for me to be sad right now, but why is my subconscious bringing this up? There must be something more to it, right? But in Western medicine, we say, oh yeah, the more to it is because, well, you have, your genetics, or it's in your genetic to be depressed or to be anxious or to be schizophrenic, oh yeah, you're just too stressed. Let's give you some medications and help suppress it down. But really, even though if it's a negative output or an abnormal output, we should still trust it and then try to almost like dissect it and see, where is this coming from? Because a lot of times we'll think it's coming from our childhood. And that's something that I hate, is that people constantly blame mental health on childhood and trauma or unresolved childhood trauma, right? And a lot of it is not necessarily that. It's that the brain got stuck kind of in that chaotic environment, and it continues to duplicate that chaos into the adult world. And the biggest thing to me is why we struggle with mental health is because we don't understand ourselves. We don't know how to keep up with ourselves.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I mean, there's truth to, we don't understand the mind. Like, we understand the cosmos more than the mind. And then when we don't understand it, we try to be God and try to fix it with all the tools we do, which don't work. So we throw SSRIs and SNRIs and everything else at it, thinking that that'll work. It doesn't. But then we're almost too cocky and have too much hubris to try something else. Our system hasn't gone beyond Prozac, really, and that's to the detriment of our society.
Yeah.
So to have something new that we didn't create, the West sometimes doesn't like that. When it's natural, we kind of think, that's hippie stuff. We've got to be able to do better. Look at us. If we go to the moon, we can do better than nature. But sometimes that hubris gets us into trouble. And so it's good to respect nature and to understand that she's been around longer than us and has figured some things out. And not to say that Western medicine or science can't do better in some ways, of course, but there's a balance. And the balance, we got a little bit carried away with the chemical revolution of the 20th century and onwards now into the 21st century. And I think now we're starting to learn that only because of the unfortunate disaster that we've had with things like depression and post-traumatic stress that can't be healed by the pills. And we've just seen it. So now, unfortunately, it's taken us this amount of time to look for other solutions that we're here, but weren't taken seriously. So it's nice to see them now being taken seriously by the likes of Imperial College and King's and UCLA, and it's a number of different groups that have really taken on the charge. Johns Hopkins, of course. So the more we can do while keeping a serious tone, so that it doesn't become an issue, or at least increases people's scared perception, then I think we're going to do this a good service, and more people can get access, and it doesn't become just for only a very small few that it has been so far.
Yeah. I think that's a piece too, right? Is MDMA just got eaten by the FDA. But to me, the reason that it did is because we're trying to put a square hole in square peg, or what is it? Square
in a round hole.
A round hole.
Yep.
But we, the piece with that, because if they were going to, and now hindsight's 2020, if they were going to get MDMA approved, if I can say that, they should have done the drug with no therapy, period, right? That's why Spravato got approved. Spravato is ketamine, it's the left side of ketamine. They did the drug with no therapy because the FDA doesn't know how to regulate therapy. It's a variable.
And that variable, unfortunately, increased the risk of nefarious activity.
It did, but the system's not been built for it, right? So, that's the unfortunate piece, because we know there is ultimate proof that therapy with psychedelics greatly increases the efficacy of this. And it also, it increases the chance of people becoming harmed by it, because you have somebody there who's helping to guide your way or whatever else, right? And a lot of people can do psychedelics on their own. But my thing is all about regulation, right? It's what's the correct dose? What's the correct frequency? And we don't know that yet. So it's good just to have almost a third party, even if you do them by yourself, to where if you have a friend, right? Or a therapist or a coach, and just say, hey, I dosed the other night. This is where I'm at. This is how I'm improving. Because if you have a friend who's dosing, macro dosing daily, and, and they're like, oh yeah, I'm great. And it's no, you're not allowing the medicine to actually do what needs to be done. So, it's kind of like cannabis. I talked about this on the podcast too. It's we still don't know the dose and the frequency of cannabis right now either. And it's, there's a lot of people out there who can use it to their benefit, but the people who start using cannabis 8-10 times a day, and then they start having, abdominal pain, they're going to the ER, their anxiety's all over the place. They're, having atypical thoughts, they're inducing psychosis because they're constantly living in an abstract world if they're smoking, 10 times a day. Psilocybin, magic mushrooms, LSD, 5-MeO, all these guys. So list just top to bottom, because there are so many different retreats out there. And I know we focus just on psilocybin and ketamine aspects. But can you do an overall, just from your psychedelic expertise, top to bottom, what's out there how short or long acting is that drug? And then what is it being looked at?
Sure. Well, I'll start with psilocybin. Psilocybin is roughly 4 to 6 hours length.
Macrodose, which is a big dose.
Yep.
Completely different than the microdosing that some people will do daily or 3 days a week or take, 7 days off or whatever else, little guys.
Yeah. And if we lived in a world where it was legal in the US, legal in Canada, I would recommend people start with a microdose regimen before they did a macrodose. If somebody came to me and is interested, is going through something wherever they're at, if they were able to, I would say start with some microdosing every other day, see how you feel, get your toes in the water before doing a macrodose. But we don't live in that world, so...
And I'll throw in a risk there that I was reading about the other day with microdosing that people should be aware of is if they have like mitral valve prolapse or any type of like mitral valve issues, they need to be aware that there's some data coming out on microdosing daily that may affect their valve. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Look at that research.
Yep.
So that would be, now what's wonderful about psilocybin is it's one of the most studied. And so we know it works well with depression, 80+%. Same with addiction. That addiction was tobacco and alcohol. So I can't speak to other drugs that people or things that people might be addicted to, but they do work in the same areas of the brain. So if somebody was addicted to shopping, let's say, or gambling, I would say it's worth them exploring, given that we've seen remarkable data on other addictions. Now, there's no promises. Everyone's different. Post-traumatic stress, it's certainly helped a lot of people, and that's in the data. That's in the published data. Anxiety hasn't had as much research done on it, but a lot of people have found that microdosing specifically and macrodosing for a long period of time helps them with their anxiety. We've discussed the modality and how it's administered. We usually administer it with lime juice. That allows for the alkaloids to be pulled out and allows for the uptake to be quicker.
Which is called what? Lemon teching?
That's right. And then we also supply it in an edible format. So usually chocolate, sometimes gummies. That allows for it to be a little bit of a longer process.
So it's something that people, psilocybin, they orally ingest psilocybin all the time.
All the time, yeah. Now, there is people working on sublingual, there's people working on IV, psilocin. Our body turns the psilocybin into psilocin. So psilocybin gets a lot of the credibility, but it's actually the prodrug. And psilocin is actually in the mushroom as well. So you have pure psilocin, goes directly into the brain, on the body into the brain. And then you have psilocybin, prodrug to psilocin. So I just say that because there is work on psilocin as an IV, which will be very fast acting. So that's coming, but not here yet.
And then so many people will say, well, why is psilocybin, if it's so safe and it's so natural, why is it not FDA approved? And I think you and I were actually on a call one time with Johns Hopkins talking about this specifically, but psilocybin has like over 600 molecules.
Well, magic mushrooms do.
Which is psilocybin?
Psilocybin is one of them. Yeah.
Oh, all of the little guys.
Yeah. So psilocybin is one compound. But then in a magic mushroom, you'll have baeocystin, norbaeocystin, originacin, psilocin. So when you have a magic mushroom, it has a number of compounds. But psilocybin itself can be synthetically created, or it could be...
Right, but from the natural standpoint, because they were trying to isolate the magic mushrooms from the natural standpoint, some of those molecules started dying in like seconds, where the FDA wants one molecule
to test. Yep. Which is why any natural product has that issue. So either you synthetically create it, which is where a lot of the research is on psilocybin right now. So it's created with using benzene. Not ideal, but that's how you create it. Or they've taken what we call full spectrum, which is the biomass, which is the mushroom, dried, powdered, pulverized, and then they've extracted the compound that they want. So you're still not getting the magic mushroom. Nature created it with all of these compounds together for a reason. We don't know why. We haven't really done the research on all the compounds I noted earlier. But we know that they're in there. We know that they're together. We know that there's a specific ratio. Now, what's remarkable is that when you just take one of those compounds out, psilocybin or psilocin, you still see remarkable effect. So it's like taking a wonderful meal that is meant to have 5 plates in it, and you take one part of one plate, and people are still full and still happy and still satiated. I mean, what an amazing meal that is, that you can take one piece and it's still going to help people.
I know.
But I understand the FDA wants to have a very structured product testing where they take one compound, go through all stages, phase 1, 2, 3, and then, okay, now we'll try A and B. But unfortunately, in the mushroom, there's over 50. So you have 2 alphabets worth that you'd need to try. The combinations is innumerable. So where does that leave us? It's going to continue to be as we've operated outside of the US. I think we will see state by state. And federal, I don't know, because the FDA has...
They have to make a new category. It's not going to fit. And the more we try to make it fit, it's not going to work. So they have to make a new category to where there's multiple compounds, and then also therapy, right? That's the variable aspect. There's 2 variables trying to prove if this medication works.
Yep. Now on to the next one. Then there's iboga. Iboga is wonderful for...
So what's the difference in iboga and ibogaine?
Ibogaine is it's been extracted. So anytime you see an ene, like cocaine, that's because it's been extracted. So you have the plant or the product, the fungi, and then it's been extracted. So then it's an ene. So ibogaine is ibogaine. And so you're just taking the natural iboga, and then you're doing an extraction so that you can get it a little more concentrated.
So it'd be like psilocybin and psilocin.
No, a little bit, but not. Even with iboga, you're not taking just one compound. You're extracting it using like a process. Sometimes it's just water. Sometimes there's a solvent, but you're concentrating it.
Okay.
So that's really good for addiction. If somebody has a very strong addiction to anything, it doesn't need to be a very strong drug. It could just be a strong hold on somebody. So it could be shopping, but this person has tried everything. And if they've tried psilocybin and it didn't work or it doesn't work, then I would recommend them to try iboga. Iboga is extremely serious though. So I don't recommend. There's a heart issue. And if somebody's
like, I have a heart attack, about try it, or is it like an electrical thing to where my heart rate's going to like...
Well, everybody has an ECG before that they are allowed to do, but it's a mix. If somebody has a good ECG reading but has a very strong past of doing crack cocaine or heroin, their heart is still at risk. So you can't just say, ECG looks good, let's go.
So if I've had an abnormal heart rhythm in the past, then maybe I wouldn't be the best candidate for iboga.
No. Yeah. If you have any issues with sleep apnea or atrial fibrillation, those could also be issues.
Yep.
So you should take them all very seriously, but iboga specifically has some very well-known, well-documented risks to the heart. Now it becomes an issue because some people are addicted to drugs and know that they're going to die if they continue down this road. And they're willing to take the risk with iboga and informed consent that this could cause a serious heart issue, even fatal. So informed consent again.
But if I'm at risk from my cardiac past and I have an addiction, can I try ketamine or psilocybin? Maybe if iboga is too much to psilocybin and ketamine.
Yeah, I think cannabis, psilocybin, ketamine are all ones that I consider in the safer edge of the category and should be starting with. I would say that psilocybin is safer than SSRIs to start with. Now that's debatable, but I do believe that that's better for people to start on than going full course SSRI, SNRI, something strong that they might be on for decades.
Well, let's go back to psilocybin for a second because you just sparked my memory with that. I'm on 15 medications for my mental health, including benzodiazepines. So I've been taking Xanax for 26 years, and I'm on 3 antidepressants, 4 antipsychotics.
Mm-hmm.
I really want to try psilocybin because I can't function anymore. Do I need to stop taking my medicines and I just want to do psilocybin like 3 days?
No. But we do have those conversations where people are at the end of their rope. They're very, I want it now. And that's our society. So it's not actually that unique, unfortunately. And absolutely not. You should not cold turkey without medical supervision. And most doctors don't want you to cold turkey anyway. There's not a lot of studies on taking people off of these drugs. We have a lot of on, and we have studies up to less than a year. We don't have any beyond that. We don't have any taking people off. So it's a scary part for a lot of doctors.
Well, and here's the thing too. The big reason it's scary is because they train us to prescribe.
Mm-hmm.
There's zero training in de-prescribing.
Sure.
Zero.
Yep.
Nobody's trained to take anybody off, right?
I know.
And if you understand, like, you know, the way, right, the way that you look at it from a pharmacologic standpoint is there's something called a half-life.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, when you look up the medication, it will have a half-life in there of how many hours. Well, the drug has to go through 3 cycles of a half-life in order to be about 98% cleared in your system. But that's after you take it one time, right? So people are taking a medication day over day for years. Your plasma levels of your blood are going to have a very high concentration of medication to where that half-life, say the half-life's 7 hours, right? So that drug technically will be out of your system in 21 hours. But if you take it day over day, it may take a month, 6 weeks to start getting that drug out of your system. And then I always tell people, because I think in society, we just have a very wrong definition of addiction. Your brain's addicted to SSRIs, to SNRIs, to antipsychotics. It's addicted to all the stuff. It needs it, right? Because you have receptors that it's been bonding to. We take it away, these little receptors are still waiting for their drug. And they're hyperactive, right? So people, when they start having side effects coming off this medication, it's because their brain's addicted to the medication and it's having withdrawal effects, right? So people will get something called brain zaps to where they feel literally electrical energy zapping their brain, right? There's a drug called Effexor that I've had people say, you know what? I was on heroin and then I also was on Effexor. Effexor was harder to come off of than heroin. Wow. Right? So it's crazy. But like what I do, and I'll tell you one of my personal stories. I had a client years ago, and this is why I disagree. I know a lot of retreats will say, we want you completely clean before you come down and you participate with any type of psychedelics. And I disagree with that, but that's my personal opinion because people are struggling, right? They're stuck. They feel like crap. So now I'll tell people, it's like, all right, come down, let's do it. Let's get you a stronger base to where we can then start tapering you off of medicines. And when we start tapering you off, your side effects, you'll be able to tolerate them better because you're coming at it from a stronger sense. But I had a lady one time and we did, her psychiatrist was like, yep, just take her off. She's been on clonazepam, which is like the longest benzodiazepine you can have in your system, longest acting one. She'd been on it for about 15 years. And he's like, yeah, just tell her to taper off in like 10 days. And then we're like, all right. So we help her taper off. She does amazing with ketamine, and ketamine helps with detox so much. So people are coming off of medications. Ketamine's making new receptors in the brain that aren't addicted to the other substance that you were on, whatever that may be. So she looks amazing. She calls me in like 3 months. And she was like, hey, I'm trying to wonder if this was a side effect from ketamine, but my whole body is numb from my nose down. And I was like, what? And, so there's something called like circumoral numbness, and it comes from like a calcium deficiency. So I made her go get her labs drawn, all her electrolytes, everything looked fine. And I was like, she's like, I can't feel my body. And I was like, I have no idea what that means. So I went through and I was like, all right, what meds are you on? Kind of stuff. Are you not on? So she went off basically the 10-day taper, right? We did 10-day taper, but then she was cold turkey off of clonazepam.
Right.
So there's something called post-acute withdrawal syndrome, and Europe actually looks at it way more than I don't even know if we recognize it in the States. But it is where when people come off of benzodiazepines, they had a risk at having this acute withdrawal syndrome. And the side effects can last for 10 to 15 years.
Wow.
So when people think we have an opiate crisis, no, we're going to have a benzodiazepine crisis. So ultimate recommendations for benzos when you're coming off of them, right? Benzos are Xanax, which is alprazolam. You got Valium. You've got clonazepam, which is also Klonopin, and Valium's flurazepam. But when you have all of these medications in your system, the way you taper off of benzos, the best recommendation there is right now is 10% of the dose every 90 days. So you're a chronic benzo user if you've been on benzos for greater than 6 weeks, taking them daily. And what it does, right, because when I saw all this stuff, I was reading about it and I was blown away and I was like, what are we doing? But it blocks certain hemispheres in your brain. Benzos do. And so it blocks the hemisphere. And when the benzo goes away, that hemisphere actually starts regenerating. But when it's regenerating, there's hyper-excitable cells there that are hyperactive. So there was a very sad story of a physician that I read about. He was at Johns Hopkins. He was an orthopedic surgeon. Didn't need his benzos anymore. He's doing great. Psychiatrist retired, decided he wasn't going to get more benzos because, 6 weeks, right? Whatever. Come off of them. And he had such bad anxiety. And that's what happens when you come off of benzos too fast. Their anxiety is actually worse than when they started, if they do it incorrectly. So he ended up killing himself.
He just couldn't deal with the anxiety.
No, couldn't deal with the anxiety anymore. And that's the unfortunate piece is there's psychiatrists, there's prescribers out there that will say, give it 7 to 10 days and you'll be fine. Or if you're being, overly cautious, it's 6 weeks. And nobody's saying, hey, I'm going to put you on this benzodiazepine, but when you start tapering off of it, we need at least 900 days. Nobody's saying that. So people are, being put at risk with that. So anyway, the reason I say all that stuff, me personally, stay on the meds that you're on. When we get you a stronger base, then we can start tapering down. But when you taper, you're messing with the entire landscape of your brain, everything, to where you need to consider that. Because people, when they start coming off these meds, they will have suicidal ideations that they've never had in the past. They won't sleep for 4 days. They're having brain zaps. They're agitated. They're irritated. Their skin feels like it's crawling. There's horrible side effects with these drugs. And if you are able to do it in a fashion to where it's responsible and you're able to do ketamine or psilocybin along with it, it's taking off the detox symptoms. That's my ultimate recommendation to people.
Yep, I think that's fair. I think that's safe. Yeah, it's that's another beauty of psilocybin is that if somebody's on an SSRI, we use the analogy of a parking space, that the SSRI is in the parking space, and psilocybin is trying to get into the same parking space. So there's not a risk of, fatality or injury or overdose. It's just that you're not going to have the experience that you kind of deserve and should have because the brain already has a car in the parking space. So that's what's another wonderful thing of psilocybin is that it is incredibly safe, even with something like a Prozac or lorazepam. It's actually, it can play with them. It's just you're not going to have the experience that you really should have. You're not going to get the full experience.
So one of the things that people do worry about with psilocybin, if they're on serotonin drugs, is they're worried about serotonin syndrome that can happen. And that's a big theory, that's out there and people should be very well aware of. Your providers or whomever, right? If they're giving me psilocybin, they should be aware of serotonin syndrome. And that's where, there's too much serotonin in the body and your heart, your temperature can go up to, 106, 107 degrees. If I were to see that in the operating room, what we would do is we would, you actually paralyze the person on purpose and put them on a breathing machine because you're trying to decrease the energy and you put cooling blankets on them. We're all trained on it, but it's like, has it ever happened? I mean, has somebody worked a 50-year career and never seen serotonin syndrome? Absolutely. We're just all aware of it. So that's something people should be aware of. But the thing about serotonin receptors, right? So those guys are blocking to increase your serotonin level. Serotonin is maximally produced under stressful conditions. So we're using all the serotonin. You know, I tell people, like, when we're on these SNRIs and SSRIs, it's like a gas tank with a hole in it. And we're just giving you more gas by giving you the SSRIs and SNRIs if there's a hole in the gas tank. So you're barely getting what you need. Whereas like ketamine and psilocybin, it's going to help actually patch the hole where you can start rebuilding. So that is something, you know, with serotonin receptors, people should be aware of, but the risk, you know, who knows, maybe it's a 0.001% chance that somebody would have that. But so that's psilocybin, iboga. How long does that iboga experience last?
12, 24 hours. Yeah, it's very long. It's very serious. It's very strong. I really, it's an unregulated area, this whole space. And that's a good thing in a lot of ways. At the same time, it's one of those things I do kind of worry about. Is somebody just jumping into iboga because they heard about it? Similarly, ayahuasca. Ayahuasca gets a lot of credibility, from a lot of talk, a lot of people discussing it, sometimes even more than psilocybin. It's a long dose. There's purging involved. It's usually done somewhere traditional, like in the Amazon jungle. So again, everybody gets their own options. We're all adults, but I think starting with something like psilocybin that doesn't involve purging, that does have some legality or legal areas in the world where you can have a clinical retreat, which is what we do here, is key. Start with the safest. Psilocybin is considered the safest, safer than alcohol, and then go up from there as needed. That's what I've
sure.
really.
I think that's good advice.
You know, and if you're much more of a clinical type, and you can't leave the U.S., then I think ketamine's a very safe one as well. We've proven that over decades of use.
And I think that's something too to consider, right? Is if you don't have 3 weeks to do the series of ketamine, right? Because typically people recommend 2 over the course of 3 weeks, or some will recommend 3 over the course of 2 weeks. But still, yeah, it's a very intense 2 to 3 weeks. And if your work schedule doesn't allow it, that's the beautiful thing about these retreats, right? They're 4 days long, right? So they're Thursday through Sunday kind of thing. Or they're 5 days for people who have 5 days. But in that way, like you're peace out, you're fully immersed, and then you're back in, and you're really a new person. A lot of people feel like. Overall summary of the other guys: LSD, 5-MeO. Like, what else is out there for people? Just like
to explore in the psychedelic kingdom. Yeah, LSD. Very well known, quite safe. Usually synthetically created. Originally it wasn't, but now it is. They've found that it has a lot of the similarities to psilocybin. It's quite interesting when you look at the compound makeup of psilocybin and LSD.
LSD came from a mushroom at one time, right? Ergot?
Ergot, yeah. Yeah, a fungi. Yeah.
Pretty smart.
Sometimes. And so there's but if you look at the brain's, some of the brain's happy chemicals. So if you look at, I think it's serotonin actually, serotonin, psilocybin, LSD, they all look very similar, which is just amazing.
Okay.
One is, in you, one is from nature, and one is from a lab. All share this similarity. It's very interesting. So they do have similar benefits. So if you take LSD, on microdose or macrodose, you're going to have some similarities to a psilocybin journey. And
what's the length of LSD?
It's shorter. It all depends on how much you take, how many mics they call it. I'd say it's psilocybin is 4 to 6 hours, LSD, depending on how much you take. But if you don't kind of re-up or take more, it's about 4 to 5 hours. So it's not much, but it does seem.
I hear most people say it's around 12.
Depends on how much you take. It's it really does. And then with psilocybin, you're out, but you have an afterglow. With LSD, there's an afterglow, but it's less. So it's one of these, just like anything with psychedelics, it's difficult to explain. My personal use, when I've taken and not taken more, it was 4 to 5 hours of like a real experience. I did notice that I was more coherent with LSD than with psilocybin. So I could kind of get up and walk around a little more, but it all depends on the strength. And
the LSD, the data, there's a lot of studies for LSD looking at anxiety specifically for LSD.
Yeah. LSD is interesting because it's not, as we discussed, natural anymore. It's synthetically created, derived. That in my experience, in my dose, I was seeing a lot of mechanical, industrial visions, and it was probably placebo. It was probably my mind knowing that it's not a natural thing, so I was creating those visions. I don't know, but a different experience, but still felt safe. We've done a lot of research on LSD. It's been around a while, so there's a considerable wealth of knowledge on it. There's not as many retreats for LSD that I've heard of, which is kind of interesting. It does seem to be a designer drug or a designer-esque drug that's available everywhere in the world illegally, but is just available. I don't hear about LSD retreats, although they could and probably should exist. And then you have ayahuasca. We kind of touched on it.
5-MeO.
5-MeO. 5-MeO is it's a wild.
And 5-MeO is related to DMT, or they're separate?
DMT is, so dimethyltryptamine is in almost everything on this planet. Has a very...
We naturally have DMT in our brain as well.
In addition, correct.
Right.
So DMT is the active compound that is in ayahuasca.
And it's the most powerful hallucinogenic out there.
That's a tough one. There's no, how would you prove that?
So I don't disagree with you, right?
But bombastic statement. How would you prove it? But it is strong. And what's amazing about DMT is that you're bungee jumping into a full psychedelic experience.
In like 3 seconds.
And then you're bungee, the uptake is 3 seconds. The length is 15 minutes. And then you're back. Which to a virgin to psychedelics is
highly traumatic.
Yeah. So, but there's DMT pens out now.
Yeah.
And that's just scary because somebody could be at a concert,
in a car,
cannabis, or in a car and just hit it.
Absolutely.
So it's up to the industry to like self-police a little bit.
So is that 5-MeO the same thing as a DMT pen? For no, they're different drugs completely.
Well, there's different ways to extract DMT. So you can have a synthetic. Then you can have from the toad. The toad...
Is 5-MeO... Tell me what 5-MeO is.
I don't know the acronyms.
But it's 5-MeO, a derivative of DMT.
It is DMT, yeah. Yeah, so...
Is it from the frog and synthetic? It's still 5-MeO?
It's still DMT, but one is from a frog, and the 4 frogs are getting squeezed like mad in the Amazon. There's people with...
so funny, isn't it?
There's people with like
all these like pro-PETA people who are burning frogs. They're burning themselves to get their frog juice on.
Well, yeah.
Or the little guys.
It's not fair to the frogs.
No,
it's just
not.
But everybody wants the natural.
It's very biased.
So they want to do it.
Animal torture.
Yeah.
But we won't test makeup on rabbits, but we're going to torture frogs. I'm right there with you.
You have ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is made of a root and a plant. They do not grow next to each other.
Oh, right.
Somehow the wonderful Amazonian people figured out, if I take this...
Actually, 40 of them died.
Is an inhibitor, probably more than that. The inhibitor, so our stomach acid will stop the actual process. So you take the root... You take a plant to inhibit the inhibitor, which will then
align with the root, right?
Yeah.
So ayahuasca is what, 2 plants?
I don't know. I wish I did. But the fact is that our body normally will not allow us to have the psychedelic experience. So we need to inhibit that inhibitor that we have naturally. Mm-hmm. That's what one of the plants does. And the other is the one that actually gives us the experience. So quite amazing. So you have a long experience with ayahuasca. If you want to have a quick experience, you're going to ingest either smoke or have it topically applied DMT. So DMT is they call it the God molecule, and it should get that designation. It's quite amazing. Well, it's in everything. The grass out there has a small amount of DMT. Our pineal gland has DMT in it. When we die, it's released. So it is everywhere. So everybody's holding is an old quote from Timothy Leary.
What would you say? So say somebody's done a retreat and it was not a great experience, right? Like, say they had their facilitator was doing the drugs with them, and then they may have been throwing up at the same time that you were throwing up because they wanted to empathize with you from all these different pieces.
Mm-hmm.
What would you recommend to people who have been in the psychedelic space? They had an abnormal experience. It wasn't a great experience, but they feel like there's more potential there. What would you tell them?
Well, I mean, what was wrong with the experience, right? Was it?
I mean, could they reach out to you? Could they reach out to Revitalist or Wait?
Yeah, we'd love to hear from them. We would love to bring people along a clinical retreat. That's what we've always called it, because we're bringing the clinical experience, the clinical way of working. So FDA designated devices, the intakes are all logged. We want to make sure that people have the best experience.
Quantifying metrics so we can find the data so we can move forward.
Exactly. So reach out to us, do more research. Don't try and go be a hero and go for the strongest psychedelic. Start low and go slow. And I think psilocybin's the best one for that.
So if people are looking for more information on the retreats, what would you tell them? Where do they go? Who do they call? Who do they talk to?
Yeah. Go to our website. Go to wake.net. Go to revitalist.com. And either make a phone call or fill out the form and start your process.
Awesome. All right. Anything else? Any 2 cents you want to give the public out there?
No, I think that's a good starter point. So maybe we can do another one of these one day.
All right. Well, that is Nick Murray live on the Revitalist podcast. Thanks for being here, Nick.